Sometimes, ordinary recordings capture things that no one can explain. In 2016, a security camera recorded a man walking into a room. 3 seconds later, he disappeared. No one ever saw him leave. In 2019, a simple family photograph triggered a police investigation because someone appeared in the picture who did not exist. And in 2017, a late-night emergency call confused investigators because the man on the phone said, "I've already died once." These are 3 real cases that still remain unexplained. In June 2016, a security camera inside an office building captured something strange. A man walks into a room. The door never opens again. No one comes out. But 3 seconds later, the room is empty. December 2018. Winter in the American Midwest was unusually cold that year. In an industrial area outside Cleveland, Ohio, the streets were almost completely empty at night. During the day, trucks and workers filled the warehouses. But after midnight, the entire district fell silent. Only the streetlights and a few security cameras remained active. At 2:03 a.m., Matthew Collins, the night security guard at Lakefield Logistics, sat alone in the small monitoring room. His job was simple. Every 30 minutes he checked the surveillance feeds and signed the patrol log. The room contained a row of aging monitors. One of them displayed the camera facing the warehouse back door. The door was rarely used. Most deliveries entered through the front gate, and the rear entrance was typically reserved for maintenance workers. Just as Matthew was about to finish his routine check, he noticed something unusual. The door on the screen was slowly opening. At first, he thought he had imagined it. He stared at the monitor. The heavy metal door was definitely moving. The gap between the door and the frame slowly widened, as if someone outside was pushing it open. But there was one problem. There was no one outside. The camera clearly showed the concrete ground behind the building. No vehicles. No people. Nothing that could explain what was happening. Matthew frowned. He picked up the radio and asked the other guard, who was patrolling a different building, whether anyone was near the rear entrance. The reply came back quickly. "No, I'm at the East Warehouse." Matthew looked back at the screen. The door was now fully open. Inside the warehouse, the lights were still off, leaving the entrance corridor dim and shadowy. Then the second strange thing happened. The overhead lights suddenly turned on. Rows of bright white lamps flickered to life, illuminating the entire warehouse. Matthew sat up straight. He knew one important detail. The switch for those lights was located inside the building. If someone had turned them on, that person had to be inside the warehouse. But the footage showed no one. The screen displayed nothing but empty aisles and slowly swinging metal doors. Matthew felt uneasy. He rewound the footage and played it again from the moment the door started moving. The timestamp read 1:17 a.m. First, the door handle twitched slightly. Then the door slowly opened. The entire movement lasted about 8 seconds. Then the lights came on. Still, no one appeared. Matthew stared at the monitor for several minutes. He had worked the night shift for 3 years. He had seen camera glitches, static interference, and signal failures. But he had never seen clear footage like this showing something so strange. So he decided to save the video. At 3 a.m., he exported the file and stored it in the company's backup system. The next morning, the warehouse manager reviewed the recording. At first, everyone assumed it was a technical problem. Maybe the door lock was loose. Maybe the electrical system malfunctioned. But when they continued watching the footage, something even stranger appeared. At 1:23 a.m., a row of metal shelves deep inside the warehouse began to shake slightly. The shelves were stacked with dozens of boxes of electronic parts. The movement was subtle, almost like someone had just walked past them. But once again, there was no one there. The camera showed the aisle clearly. Empty. The room grew quiet as the staff watched the recording. Someone joked nervously. Maybe there's something in the warehouse. No one laughed, because they all saw the same thing. The shelves were still trembling slightly, as if someone invisible had just brushed past them. The footage was soon copied and handed over to local police. A few days later, a detective reviewing the recording paused the video and said something unusual. The door didn't open by itself. He froze the frame at 1:17 a.m. Then pointed at the screen. Look right here. The door handle. Just before the door opened, it moved, as if something unseen had grabbed it. After the footage was submitted, the case was first assigned to Detective Daniel Harris from a suburban police department near Cleveland. In the initial report, the incident was classified as an equipment anomaly investigation. In other words, it wasn't considered a real criminal case. At least not at first. Detective Harris watched the footage for the first time in the company's meeting room on a laptop. The video was short, from 1:15 a.m. to 1:30 a.m., about 15 minutes in total. When the door slowly opened, nearly everyone in the room frowned. The recording looked perfectly clear. There were no glitches, no static, and no frame skips. The door simply opened. But there was nothing outside. The lights turning on was even stranger. The warehouse manager explained that the lights had only two control switches. One was located in a control box near the main entrance. The other was mounted on the wall just inside the rear door. If someone turned on the lights, that person had to be inside the warehouse. But the video showed no one. Harris replayed the footage several times before suggesting the most common explanation. The surveillance system may have been tampered with. This was not unusual in commercial theft cases. If someone accessed the system beforehand and edited the recordings, they could create the illusion that no one appeared. So the police decided to inspect the entire surveillance system. The following afternoon, two technicians arrived at the warehouse to examine the cameras and the recording server. The setup wasn't complicated. There were 12 cameras connected to a local recording unit. All footage was stored automatically for 30 days. The technicians first checked the timestamps. If the footage had been edited or replaced, the timeline would usually show gaps. But the result was strange. All timestamps were perfectly continuous. No breaks. No missing frames. Next, they examined the file structures. Every segment had a complete data index. There were no signs of alteration. In other words, the recording appeared to be original. The room fell silent. The warehouse manager asked the question everyone was thinking. So how did the door open? The technicians didn't answer. Instead, they began checking the other cameras. 3 different angles covered the rear entrance area. If someone had walked in or out, at least one camera should have captured it. They started reviewing the footage frame by frame. At 1:17 a.m., the rear camera recorded the door opening. At the same time, the interior cameras were also recording normally. But the result was the same. No one appeared. Not only that, during the seconds before and after the door opened, none of the other cameras showed any unusual movement. No footsteps. No shadows. Not even signs of someone stepping on the ground outside. Detective Harris began considering another possibility. Maybe someone was already inside the warehouse. If a person had hidden among the shelves beforehand, they could have turned on the lights without being seen. So the police requested the company's employee records. Lakefield Logistics had 26 employees. 6 of them had keys to the warehouse. Investigators contacted each of them. Their responses were almost identical. No one had been at the warehouse that night. 2 of them even provided alibis. The investigation seemed to return to square one. Just as the police were preparing to wrap up the inspection, one technician suddenly spoke. "Wait." He rewound the footage to the exact moment when the door first moved. Timestamp 1 o'clock 17 minutes 3 seconds AM. He zoomed in. The door handle filled the entire screen. Everyone leaned forward. After a few seconds, the technician said quietly, "Do you see it? The door handle." Just before the door opened, it turned slightly, as if someone outside had grabbed it and twisted. But the hand never appeared in the video. The room fell silent again. The warehouse manager finally whispered, "If the footage wasn't tampered with, then what was outside that door?" This time, even the detective didn't answer immediately, because in his career he had seen many strange cases, but never footage like this. An unseen person opening a door, while the camera recorded nothing. That evening, the police decided to take the footage back to the station for further analysis. What they didn't know yet was that the strangest part of the case had not happened, because during a second examination a few days later, technicians would discover a tiny detail everyone had overlooked. A faint shadow right on the ground near the door. After the police brought the footage back to the station, the first step in the investigation was to interview the night guard on duty. Matthew Collins had been working at the company for 3 years. His employment record was clean. No disciplinary issues, no financial problems. At least on the surface, he had no reason to fabricate a strange story. The interview took place in a small meeting room at the police station. Detective Harris placed a laptop on the table and played the surveillance footage again. The door slowly opened. The lights turned on. The warehouse remained empty. When the video ended, Harris looked up. "What did you think when you first saw this?" Matthew paused for a moment. "Honestly, I thought the camera system was broken." He explained that he didn't call the police immediately. In night security work, minor camera glitches were not unusual. Sometimes the camera angle shifted. Sometimes lights reflected strangely. But when the lights suddenly turned on, he began to feel uneasy. Harris asked another question. "Did you hear anything inside the warehouse?" Matthew hesitated. "A little." The atmosphere in the room immediately changed. Matthew explained that he had heard faint noises, metal sounds, almost like something being moved far away. The problem was that the monitoring room was separated from the warehouse by a thick wall. Under normal circumstances, he shouldn't have been able to hear anything. "Why didn't you check immediately?" Harris asked. Matthew sighed. "Because something like this had happened before." That answer caught the investigator's attention. Harris asked him to explain. Matthew said that during the past year, strange small incidents had occasionally happened in the warehouse. Boxes were sometimes found in slightly different positions the next morning. Sometimes items seemed to be missing from certain shelves. At first, employees assumed someone had simply misremembered where things were placed. But the incidents became more frequent. The strange part was, the cameras never captured anyone. Harris asked a key question. Did the company ever lose inventory? Matthew shook his head. At least nothing had been officially reported. If there had been confirmed theft, the company would have filed a police report. But management always assumed it was internal error. At that point, Harris replayed the footage again. This time, he moved the timeline forward to 1:23 a.m. The row of metal shelves began to shake again. Harris paused the frame. "Did you notice this at the time?" Matthew nodded. He said that was the moment he first felt genuinely afraid. Because he suddenly realized something. Something might actually be moving inside the warehouse. "Did you check the building?" Harris asked. Matthew nodded again. Around 1:30 a.m., he grabbed a flashlight and walked to the warehouse. The door was still open. The lights were all on. But there was nothing inside. The shelves stood still. No one. No footprints. Not even marks on the ground outside. Near the end of the interview, Harris asked one final question. Did you notice anything unusual when you entered? Matthew thought for a moment. Yes. He said that when he walked inside, there was a strange smell in the air. It wasn't dust. And it wasn't the usual metallic smell of the warehouse. It was more like something burned. A very faint burnt smell. But it was definitely there. Harris wrote that down. Because in many investigations, that kind of smell often meant one thing: electrical equipment overheating, or some kind of machine briefly running. After the interview ended, Harris opened the footage again. He paused the image on the row of shelves deep in the warehouse, then zoomed in slowly. If Matthew's memory was correct, then something had indeed moved in that warehouse. The camera simply hadn't captured it. And even stranger, during the technicians' second analysis of the footage, they noticed a new detail. Just seconds before the shelves began to shake, a distant camera in the corner of the warehouse lost focus. Only for 2 seconds. But right after those 2 seconds, the shelves began to move. After interviewing the night guard, the police decided to widen the investigation. If someone had truly been moving inside the warehouse without appearing on camera, there were only 2 realistic explanations. Either the surveillance system had a flaw, or someone knew the building extremely well enough to avoid every camera. To test the second possibility, investigators began reviewing the history of the warehouse. The Lakefield Logistics Warehouse was built in 2006. Over the years, its surveillance system had been replaced 3 times. The original cameras were installed when the building was constructed. The system was upgraded once in 2012. The current setup had been installed in 2016. Technicians began reviewing maintenance records for the equipment. It didn't take long before one name appeared repeatedly in the files: Thomas Baker. He was an external security technician. Between 2015 and 2017, Baker had been responsible for maintaining the warehouse cameras and electronic door systems. In other words, if anyone knew the details of the surveillance system, he did. Police contacted the warehouse manager and asked about him. The manager vaguely remembered the name, but he hadn't seen Baker in years. According to company records, Baker stopped working with the company in 2017 when his contract ended. However, the manager recalled something unusual. Shortly before Baker left, a small incident had occurred. It happened in the summer of 2017. An employee reported that the rear warehouse door had been found open during the night. At the time, no one thought much of it. The door lock occasionally malfunctioned, and the person responsible for repairing it was Thomas Baker. Investigators then began looking deeper into Baker's background. He was 42 years old. He had previously worked for a security equipment company before becoming an independent technician. He had installed surveillance systems for several businesses in the area. On the surface, he appeared to be an ordinary contractor. But as the investigation continued, one detail caught the detective's attention. Baker had once been questioned in connection with a warehouse theft. The case happened 3 years earlier. An electronic storage facility reported losing tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Investigators discovered that the surveillance system at that warehouse had also malfunctioned. 5 minutes of footage had been completely blank. In the end, there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone. Baker was never formally accused, but his name remained in police records. When Detective Harris reviewed the Lakefield footage again, he began thinking about something. If someone had exploited a surveillance flaw to enter the warehouse, that person would need to know 2 things: the camera angles and the weaknesses of the recording system. Thomas Baker knew both. So the police decided to find him. 2 days later, they located Baker at an apartment building in the southern part of the city. The conversation wasn't an official interrogation. Harris simply explained that they were investigating a surveillance anomaly. Baker seemed calm. He said he hadn't visited the warehouse in at least 2 years. When the detective asked whether surveillance systems could have hidden flaws, Baker smiled slightly. "Every system has flaws," he said. Then he added something unexpected. "But the problem with that system isn't the recording." Harris frowned. "Then what is it?" Baker didn't answer immediately. He looked at the detective for a moment before saying something unsettling. "You should check the infrared mode on the cameras. Some things don't appear in the normal image." That statement changed the direction of the investigation. Police soon asked technicians to examine the cameras again. During that inspection, they discovered something that no one had noticed before. One of the warehouse cameras, in night mode, could produce a very unusual visual effect. After Thomas Baker mentioned the infrared mode, the police decided to conduct a deeper technical examination of the surveillance system. This time, the focus was not the recording files. It was the cameras themselves. The Lakefield warehouse used a fairly common type of night vision camera. During the day, the cameras recorded normal color images. But when light levels dropped at night, the system automatically switched to infrared mode. Infrared LEDs illuminated the environment, and the camera recorded the reflected light. This allowed the cameras to see, even in complete darkness. However, there was a lesser-known limitation. Certain materials absorb infrared light. When an object absorbs most of the infrared radiation, its shape becomes extremely faint on camera, sometimes nearly transparent. The technicians conducted a simple test. They placed a mannequin in front of an infrared camera and covered it with a special black jacket. The jacket's surface used a light-absorbing material often used in photography equipment. The result was surprising. Most of the mannequin's body almost disappeared from the image. Only a vague outline remained. If the subject stood far enough away, it might not be visible at all. The demonstration immediately reminded Detective Harris of the warehouse footage. The door handle moved. The door opened. The shelves shook. All of those actions suggested that something had moved through the warehouse. But the camera showed no person. If someone had intentionally exploited the weakness of infrared cameras, the entire mystery suddenly had a possible explanation. The police decided to analyze the footage again. This time, they were not looking for a person. They were looking for anything unusual. Hours later, a technician noticed something. Right after the door opened, a faint dark patch briefly appeared on the floor near the edge of the frame. It lasted only a moment. Without zooming in frame by frame, it was almost impossible to see. More importantly, its position was directly in the middle of the doorway, almost as if someone had been standing there. Harris paused the footage. He stared at the shadow. It wasn't just lighting change, because it moved. Over several frames, the shape shifted slightly forward. Then it vanished, as if something nearly invisible had walked into the warehouse. Suddenly, the rest of the events made sense. The lights turned on. The shelves were bumped. The guard heard noises. All the clues pointed in the same direction. Someone might have been entering the warehouse at night using the infrared blind spot. But one question remained. If this was theft, why hadn't the company reported significant losses? And why would someone take such a risk? To answer that, investigators reviewed the warehouse inventory records again. The results appeared quickly. Items had indeed gone missing, but only small quantities. Just a few pieces at a time. Sometimes only once every month. Losses of that scale could easily be dismissed as inventory error. But when investigators organized the records, they noticed something strange. Every time an inventory discrepancy occurred, it was close to a date when the surveillance system showed anomalies. Which meant one thing. Someone might have been doing this for a long time. And that person knew the surveillance system very well. The investigation seemed close to the truth. But just before police prepared to question Thomas Baker again, technicians noticed something even stranger in the footage. In the frame where the faint shadow appeared, the door handle was turning from the inside. When technicians discovered that the door handle turned from the inside, the direction of the investigation changed again. If the door had been opened from inside the warehouse, it meant something very different. Someone might have already been inside. Detective Harris replayed the entire recording again. This time, he rewound the footage even further. The recording started just after midnight. Everything appeared quiet. Until 1:12 a.m. One of the cameras briefly flickered. The disturbance lasted less than a second. Normally, this kind of glitch would be dismissed as signal interference. But after analyzing the footage frame by frame, technicians noticed something unusual. Just before the flicker, something faint seemed to move near a row of shelves deep inside the warehouse. The movement was almost invisible. Without extreme zoom, it would be impossible to notice. This suggested a new possibility. Someone might have already been inside the warehouse before 1:12 a.m., hidden among the shelves. If that person wore clothing that absorbed infrared light, they would appear nearly invisible in night vision mode. That could explain why the cameras never captured a clear figure. The rest of the sequence now made sense. The person moved through the warehouse. They brushed against the shelves. The guard heard faint noises. Then the person walked to the rear door and opened it, possibly preparing to leave. But one problem remained. If this explanation was correct, another detail still didn't make sense. When the door opened, there were no footprints outside. Earlier that night, a light snowfall had covered the ground. If someone had walked in from outside, there should have been marks in the snow. But both the footage and the next day's inspection showed nothing. The ground outside the door was untouched. The investigation once again reached a contradiction. Days later, technicians reviewing the footage discovered one final, overlooked detail. It was extremely small. So small that everyone initially assumed it was video noise. Just seconds before the shelves moved, one of the ceiling lights at the far end of the warehouse flickered. Such flickers usually occur when electrical voltage briefly fluctuates. Technicians checked the building's power records. They found that around 1:17 a.m., the electrical system experienced a short voltage spike, less than 1 second, which suggested that some kind of device inside the warehouse may have been activated at that moment. Possibly a powered tool. If someone had been using equipment with a battery pack or motor, it could create unusual imaging effects under infrared cameras. Eventually, investigators settled on the most reasonable explanation. Someone had entered the warehouse beforehand, wearing infrared-absorbing clothing, moving in the blind spots of the surveillance system, and finally leaving through the rear door. The entire event may have exploited a flaw in the camera system. Police later attempted to investigate Thomas Baker again, but there was never enough evidence to connect him to the incident. The case was never officially charged. In the police archive, the incident was classified as unconfirmed surveillance anomaly. Years later, when the company upgraded its security system, a technician reviewed the old footage again. This time, he noticed something no one had mentioned before. Just before the door opened, two faint shadows appeared on the floor, one behind the other, as if two people were standing there. But the door handle only turned once. In 2019, a simple family photograph was taken into police evidence because someone appeared in the picture who had never existed. And strangely, no one remembered him being there. In October 2019, a small museum in the northern English city of York was organizing a collection of old photographs. The photos belonged to a local historian named Arthur Grayson, who had recently passed away. Throughout his life, Grayson had documented much of York's local history, street demolitions, wartime drills, community events, and countless everyday moments. 2 volunteers were assigned to digitize the collection. One of them was Emily Hudson, a graduate student studying history at the University of York. She often volunteered at the museum to help archive historical materials. That afternoon, she was scanning the photographs one by one. Most of them were ordinary. Street scenes, old buildings, public gatherings, until she came across one particular photograph. It was a black and white photo taken in 1963. The image showed a group of people standing together in St. Helens Square in central York. According to the handwritten note on the back, it was taken during a local Chamber of Commerce event. About 20 people stood in the picture. Men wore suits. Women wore elegant dresses. Everything looked normal. But Emily soon noticed something unusual. On the far right edge of the photograph stood a man. He wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, he was slightly turned, staring towards something outside the frame. His expression was strange. Not smiling. Not serious. More like alert. But what really stood out was his clothing. Among people dressed in clear 1960s fashion, this man was wearing what looked like a modern jacket, something closer to styles that became popular decades later. At first, Emily assumed she was mistaken. She zoomed in on the image, then zoomed in further. That was when she noticed something even stranger. The man's shadow pointed in the opposite direction from everyone else's. Every other shadow fell to the left. His fell to the right. She stared at the screen for a long time. At that moment, she simply thought the photograph looked odd. But she had no idea that what she was looking at would soon become a mystery that puzzled many people. Because a few days later, when she opened the scanned file again, the man in the photo was gone. The spot where he once stood showed only a blank section of wall, as if he had never been there at all. At first, Emily assumed it was just a computer error. Digital scanning glitches were not uncommon, especially when dealing with old photographs. Sometimes restoration software would automatically repair damaged areas, unintentionally altering parts of the image. She reopened the file. The man was still gone. Then she checked the scan history. First scan. The 14th of October 2019, 3:18 p.m. The system had saved a raw, unedited scan. Emily clicked the file. Her hand froze on the mouse. Because in that original scan, the man was still there, standing at the far right edge of the photograph, exactly as she had seen him before. Slightly turned. Not looking at the camera. That modern-looking jacket still clearly visible. Emily stared at the screen. Then she opened the second saved version. The man was gone. Back to the first version. He was there. 2 files. Identical in every detail. Except for that one person. She turned the monitor toward the other volunteer beside her. His name was Daniel, a longtime museum helper. "Did you edit the photo?" he asked. Emily shook her head. She zoomed both images side by side. They sat in silence for a few seconds. Then Daniel said quietly, "We should check the original." The physical photograph was stored in the museum's underground archive. The room contained thousands of historical images and film negatives. The air was dry. The temperature controlled. A few minutes later, they located the photograph. It was sealed inside a transparent protective sleeve. On the back, handwritten text read, "May 1963, York Chamber of Commerce Spring Gathering." Emily carefully removed the photograph. Both of them leaned over it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Because on the photograph, the man was definitely there, standing exactly where he appeared in the original scan. Daniel frowned. "That's impossible." Emily didn't respond. Something else had caught her attention. She held the photo closer to the light. Near the edge, she noticed a faint scratch mark. It didn't look like normal aging. It looked more like someone had once tried to scrape part of the image away, but had failed. While they were examining the photo, the museum director was called in. His name was Peter Rosen. He studied the photograph for a long time. Then he asked a simple question. "Are you sure this person isn't in the records?" They began checking the event list. The 1963 chamber meeting had a complete attendance log. 22 people in total. The number of people in the photograph. Also 22. But a problem soon appeared. They matched each name with each face. One by one. Everything aligned. Until the end. The list had finished. But the photograph still had one extra person. The man standing at the edge. A man with no name. Even stranger. When they scanned the photograph again, the new digital version, once again, removed him. The photograph quickly moved from being merely odd to becoming the subject of a real investigation. Museum director Peter decided to start with the most basic question. Who was the man? If the event in 1963 had been a public gathering, then in theory every person in the photograph should have an identifiable record. They enlarged and printed the photograph again. This time, they carefully cropped the section containing the man. The resolution wasn't perfect, but his face was still clear enough. He looked to be in his early 30s. Thin face. Short, neatly combed hair. But the most distinctive feature was his jacket. In Britain in 1963, men attending formal events almost always wore suits. But this man was wearing a short zip-up jacket. The collar raised. Sleeves tightened at the cuffs. It looked far more like casual clothing from decades later. Emily began searching through historical records. First, she examined the York Chamber of Commerce archives from 1963. Meeting notes. Invitation lists. Newspaper coverage. Even weather reports from that day. But nowhere did she find any reference to this man. Meanwhile, Daniel tried something different. He uploaded the cropped face into a facial recognition database. It was part of a research project designed to match faces across historical photo archives. The system searched through thousands of images. Hours later, the results came back. No matches. Not even a partial one. It was as if the man had never appeared in any photograph before. But the situation became even stranger. A few days later, while organizing boxes left behind by Arthur Grayson, Emily discovered an old notebook. The notebook looked ordinary. On the cover was a year written in pen. 1978. Inside were detailed notes about York's historical photographs. Page after page filled with small handwriting. One page caught her attention. Taped to it was a small photocopy. The image was unmistakable. It was the same 1963 Chamber of Commerce photograph. But what made Emily uneasy was this. In the photocopy, the mysterious man had been circled in red ink. Next to it were 4 handwritten words. Who is this man? Below it, in messier handwriting, was another sentence. Clearly added later. He shouldn't be here. Emily showed the notebook to Peter. The director remained silent for a long time. Because Arthur Grayson, the man who had originally collected the photograph, had already noticed the figure back in 1978. And on the final page of the notebook, there was one last note. Just 3 words. The photo changes. Later, when they returned to the computer to examine the scanned files again, Daniel suddenly said, "Wait." He was staring at the screen, his face slowly turning pale. Because the photograph had changed again. This time, it wasn't just the mysterious man who had vanished. 3 people were now missing. 3 people were now missing from the photograph. This wasn't a vague impression. It was a clear and measurable change. Emily enlarged the image on the computer. She placed the first scan, the second scan, and the newest version side by side. The difference was obvious. First version, 22 people. Second version, 21 people. Latest version, only 19. But the strangest part was this. The empty spaces didn't look like areas where someone had been erased. The background had filled itself in. The brick wall extended smoothly. The ground looked complete, as if those 3 people had never stood there at all. Daniel refreshed the file repeatedly. The image didn't change again. The room fell quiet. After a moment, Peter spoke. "Let's confirm one thing." They returned to the archive room. This time, they examined the original photograph directly. The protective sleeve was carefully opened. The photo removed. All 3 leaned over it. Emily felt her heart beating faster. Because the photograph, still, looked exactly the same. 22 people. No one missing. The mysterious man still stood at the far right. Everyone else remained in place. The digital versions were changing, but the original photograph was not. That suggested one thing. The problem wasn't the photo. It was the system recording it. Peter immediately contacted the museum's IT technician. They began examining everything. The scanning computer, software logs, storage devices, even network access records. But every system report showed the same result. The file had not been edited. No remote access. No manual changes. Meanwhile, Emily went back to Arthur Grayson's 1978 notebook. For the first time, she noticed something she had previously overlooked. On the back of the page that said the photo changes, there was another piece of writing. Very faint. Written in pencil. Almost hidden. Just 2 lines. If the photograph continues to change, then history itself is changing. Emily read the sentence several times. If Grayson had already noticed the phenomenon in 1978, then whatever was happening might have been occurring for decades. Later that night, the situation escalated. The museum's computer system performed its automatic nightly backup. At 1:14 a.m., the backup server logged a file update. The scanned photograph was saved again as a new version. The next morning, when Emily opened the computer, the first thing she saw was the photograph now contained only 16 people. But this time, what frightened them most wasn't the number. One of the missing people was someone they all recognized. He had been the host of the 1963 event, a well-known businessman in York's history. His name was Henry Walton. The problem was, when they searched the archives, there were no longer any historical records of Henry Walton at all. It was as if he had never existed. When Henry Walton's name vanished from the archives, the situation was no longer merely strange. It was frightening, because Walton was not an ordinary person. In the 1960s, he had been one of York's most successful businessmen. He owned a large textile company and had even served as vice chairman of the Chamber of Commerce. In theory, someone like that could not simply disappear from history. But now, every record was gone. Emily first checked newspaper archives. The local York newspaper maintained a digital database stretching back to the 19th century. She typed the name, Henry Walton. Search results, 0. Next she searched company registration records. The textile company Walton once owned no longer listed him anywhere. In fact, the company itself had apparently always belonged to someone else. It was as if history had quietly rewritten itself. But one thing had not changed. the original photograph. When they removed it from the archive again, Henry Walton was still standing there, in the middle of the group, smiling, holding a glass in his hand. Reality had erased him, but the photograph still remembered. Daniel stared at the image for a long time. Then he said something quietly. What if the photo is the only record left? The thought filled the room with silence. If the photograph was slowly removing people, then perhaps reality itself was doing the same. And the photo was simply the last place where they still existed. Peter decided to contact external experts. The photograph was sent to an imaging analysis laboratory. Technicians examined the film grain, chemical layers, and physical structure. Their conclusion was simple. The photograph had not been altered. No scraping. No reprocessing. It was a perfectly normal photographic print from 1963. But on the third day of the investigation, something else happened. Emily was reviewing the newest scanned version. The photo now contained only 14 people. At this point, she had almost become numb to the changes. But suddenly, she noticed something terrifying. The disappearances were not random. The order matched the notes in Arthur Grayson's notebook. She opened the 1978 notebook again. The first name listed there, already gone from the photograph. The second name, also gone. The third, the fourth, until the fifth name. That name was Henry Walton. Emily realized something then. Grayson hadn't just noticed the photograph. He had been tracking the order of disappearance. And on the final page of the notebook, there was only one name left. A single name. The last one. Beneath it was a sentence. If he disappears, I disappear too. Emily slowly lifted her head, because she recognized that name. It belonged to the man standing at the far right of the photograph. The mysterious man. At that exact moment, the computer screen refreshed. The photograph updated again. Now it showed 13 people. And the mysterious man was beginning to fade. From the edge of the image, no one left the museum that night. The computer screen remained on. The 1963 photograph was projected onto the meeting room wall. 13 people remained. Everyone waited for the next change. Minutes passed. Then hours. Nothing happened. Until 3 a.m. The screen flickered. A new version of the file appeared. Now there were 12 people in the photograph. The mysterious man on the far right was gone. Just like the others. No trace remained. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. Emily slowly opened Grayson's notebook. The final page. The name written there was fading. Within minutes, the ink disappeared completely. The page was blank, as if the name had never been written. Over the following weeks, things gradually returned to normal. The scanned file stopped changing. The photograph remained fixed, with 12 people. But something else became strange. The museum archive system listed 47 research notebooks written by Arthur Grayson. Now there were only 46. The final notebook, the one from 1978, was missing. No checkout record. No loss report. As if it had never existed. The only thing left behind was the photograph. Eventually the museum framed it again and placed it on display in the archive gallery. The label beneath it reads, York Chamber of Commerce, Spring Gathering, 1963. Visitors pass by every day. Most never notice anything unusual. They simply see a group of smiling people. 12 individuals. No one knows that the photograph once held 22. And no one remembers The man who once stood on the far right slightly turned, looking at something outside the frame. But the story may not be completely over, because in 2023, a university student researching York history discovered an old newspaper photograph from that same 1963 event. The image looked almost identical to the museum's photograph. Same location, same group, but there was one difference. The newspaper photo contained 13 people, and on the far right edge stood a man wearing a strange jacket. He wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, he was staring directly toward the photographer's side of the frame, almost as if he were looking at someone. Watching the photograph. In 2017, a late-night emergency call was recorded by police dispatch. The man on the phone kept asking the time. Then he said something strange. Then it already happened. On the 14th of March 2017, in the small city of Beckerville, Oregon, a strange call came into the local police station. The time was 2:07 a.m. The dispatcher on duty was Caitlin Moore. She answered the phone using the standard protocol. Beckerville Police Department. What is your emergency? There was silence for a few seconds. Then a man spoke. His voice was calm. Low. I need to report something. Caitlin asked. What happened? The man paused. Then he said something strange. Someone is going to die. Caitlin frowned. Who? The man replied. Me. Caitlin immediately suspected a possible suicide situation. Sir, where are you right now? The man didn't answer. Instead, he asked a question. What time is it? Caitlin checked the screen. 2:08 a.m. There was another pause. Then the man said quietly. Then there's still time. Time for what? Caitlin asked. But the man ignored the question. You should send officers to 112 Grant Street. Caitlin quickly wrote down the address. It was an ordinary residential house, less than 5 minutes from the police station. What's happening there? She asked. If you go now, the man said, you might still stop it. Stop what? Another long pause. Then he said, stop me. Caitlin's tone grew more serious. Sir, what's your name? She heard him take a breath. My name is... He stopped, mid-sentence, as if something suddenly occurred to him. Then his voice changed. Wait. What time is it now? Caitlin checked again. 2:09. The line became very quiet. After a few seconds, the man said something that investigators would later replay many times. He said, then it already happened. And the call ended. Less than a minute after the call ended, dispatch sent a patrol unit. 2 officers responded. Officer Mark Reeves and his partner, Jason Brooks. They were only a few minutes away. Driving from the station took less than 4 minutes. When they turned onto Grant Street, the time was 2:13 a.m. The street was quiet. Dim streetlights. Most houses were dark. 112 Grant Street was a 2-story house. White exterior. A large maple tree stood in the front yard. Nothing about the house looked unusual. No lights. No noise. No obvious signs of trouble. The officers parked outside. Mark radioed dispatch. We're at 112 Grant. No visible disturbance. Caitlin responded from dispatch. The caller said something would happen there. Mark glanced at the house. Curtains closed. Everything dark. He exchanged a look with Jason. They walked to the front door. Mark knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Jason muttered. Maybe a prank call. Mark didn't leave. Instead, he walked to the side window and looked in. The interior was completely dark. They were about to return to the car when a sound came from inside. Very faint, like something falling. Both officers froze. Jason moved closer to the window. Mark knocked again, louder. "Police? Anyone inside?" No response. But a few seconds later, another sound came from inside. This time, unmistakable. A gunshot. Both officers rushed the door. Mark slammed his shoulder into it. The lock broke. They entered the house. The living room was dark. There was a faint smell of gunpowder. They followed the sound upstairs. Mark and Jason drew their weapons. At the end of the hallway, one door stood half open. The light was on. They pushed the door open. Inside, there was only one person. A man lying on the floor, shot in the chest. A handgun still in his hand. No one else was in the room. Mark checked his pulse, then shook his head. Dead. Jason began searching the room. The windows were locked. No signs of forced entry. Only one door. The one they had just broken through. Which meant there had only been one person in the house. It appeared to be suicide. The situation seemed straightforward. But a problem soon appeared. When officers checked the victim's ID, they found a driver's license. The name was Daniel Carter. Dispatch quickly confirmed something troubling. The man who had made the phone call just minutes earlier had given the same name, Daniel Carter. But the most confusing detail came later. The medical examiner estimated the time of death, approximately 2:05 a.m., which meant 2 minutes after he died. Someone using his voice called the police at 2:07 a.m. The next morning, the police began a formal investigation. The first piece of evidence reviewed was the recording of the emergency call. In most American police departments, dispatch centers automatically record every call. Beckerville was no exception. The audio file was stored on the server with a clear timestamp. The 14th of March 2017. 2:07 11 seconds. Investigators listened to the recording. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The man's voice was calm, steady. He didn't sound panicked. Not like someone who had just experienced violence. But when investigators compared the call with the timeline, a problem appeared. According to the medical examiner, Daniel Carter likely died around 2:05 a.m. The emergency call began at 2:07 a.m., which meant, in theory, the call was made after he was already dead. The first explanation was simple. Time of death estimation error. Medical examiners often estimate within a few minutes. So they rechecked the body temperature, blood coagulation, room conditions. But the result didn't change. The examiner concluded the death could not have occurred later than 2:06 a.m., which still placed the phone call after his death. Investigators then considered another possibility. A prank. Maybe someone had recorded Carter's voice earlier and used an automated system to place the call. But when technicians examined the phone records, that theory was also ruled out. The call source was clear. It came from the landline inside 112 Grant Street. And it was a live call. No playback delay. No automated dialer. Dispatcher Caitlin Moore was interviewed again. She confirmed that was definitely a real conversation. Investigators then began analyzing the recording word by word. They slowed the audio, listened again, and again. During the third analysis, a technician noticed something unusual. There seemed to be another sound, In the background, very faint, almost inaudible, as if someone was speaking from another part of the room. The technician enhanced the audio, filtered the noise, then played it again. This time, everyone in the room heard it. At the moment the man says, "Someone is going to die." Another voice appears faintly in the background. It's quiet, distant, but the words are clear. The voice says, "Don't make the call." The room fell silent, because that meant that during the call, there might have been another person in the house. But police had already confirmed that night there was only one person present. All doors and windows were locked. No signs of anyone leaving. Which meant, if the second voice in the recording was real, then when the call was made, there had been 2 people in that house, and minutes later, one of them was dead. The second voice in the recording completely changed the direction of the investigation. If the phrase "don't make the call" was real, then it meant something important. At the time of the incident, there might have been a second person in the house. Police immediately re-examined the crime scene. This time, much more thoroughly. They rechecked every door and window, took new photographs, even removed sections of flooring and wall panels. But the result remained the same. No signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. No footprints. No foreign DNA. The entire house appeared to have contained only Daniel Carter. But the recording still existed. So investigators decided to analyze the voices. The audio was sent to the State Forensic Laboratory. Technicians used voice comparison software to match the caller's voice with recordings of Daniel Carter while he was alive. They gathered samples from old videos and several phone calls he had made to friends. The results came back quickly. Voice match for the primary speaker, 96%. Almost certain the caller was Daniel Carter. But the technicians encountered something far more puzzling. They also analyzed the second voice, the one that said, "Don't make the call." The clip was very short, only about 3 seconds. But the software could still perform a basic comparison. They compared the second voice to Carter's vocal profile. When the result appeared, the room went silent. Match probability, 91%, which meant the second voice was also very likely Daniel Carter. When investigators first heard this conclusion, most of them rejected it immediately, because the recording clearly suggested 2 different positions. One voice close to the phone, the other farther away. And the tone was different. The first voice sounded calm. The second sounded tense, almost desperate, as if trying to stop something. Investigators began listening to the recording again. This time, they noticed something previously overlooked. When Daniel says his first sentence, "I need to report something," there are faint footsteps in the background, as if someone is moving inside the room. Then, when he says, "Someone is going to die," the second voice appears. "Don't make the call." It sounds like someone speaking from the other side of the room. After that, the recording contains a strange moment of silence, about 5 seconds long. Then Daniel asks, "What time is it?" Investigators later speculated that something must have happened during those 5 seconds, but no one knew what, until several days later, when a technician performing advanced noise reduction discovered something almost impossible to hear. During that 5-second silence, there was actually another sentence, extremely faint, almost a whisper. When the audio was amplified 10 times, the words finally became clear. The voice said, You already made the call once. You've already called once. When technicians finally extracted that sentence from the 5 seconds of silence in the recording, the entire investigation suddenly shifted direction. Because according to the timeline, Daniel had only made one call. The emergency call to the police at 2:17 a.m. Yet the whisper in the recording clearly said, "You've already called once." If that sentence was accurate, it meant something deeply unsettling. Before the police received the emergency call, someone in that apartment had already made another call. But police system records showed only one. No second emergency call. No failed connection. No misdial. Nothing. So investigators began to suspect something else. Maybe the whisper wasn't referring to the 911 call. Maybe it was referring to another phone. Police returned to the apartment. This time, they focused on something that had previously been overlooked. A landline telephone sitting in the corner of the living room. It looked ordinary. Gray plastic body. Slightly old. A thin layer of dust on top. The original crime scene report stated that the phone had not been used. The receiver was properly placed. The cable was intact. There were no recent fingerprints on the keypad. But there was one small detail no one had noticed. On the underside of the phone base, there was an old sticker. The label read, "Line 2. Police later discovered that the apartment actually had a dual-line phone system. One line connected to the standard network. The second line was a backup line installed by the landlord years earlier. Technically, that line could also make outgoing calls. It simply wasn't used very often. The strange part was, Daniel had never mentioned this. In fact, during the initial questioning, he clearly said, "I didn't use the landline. I called the police from my phone." So investigators decided to test the second line. When technicians connected monitoring equipment, they discovered something strange. That line had placed a call at 2:12 a.m., exactly 5 minutes before the emergency call. But the problem appeared immediately. That call had not gone to the police. It went to a completely different number. A local number. Records showed the call lasted 11 seconds. Then it disconnected. Police quickly traced the number. It belonged to a prepaid mobile phone. No real name registration. No fixed address. But what made it stranger was this. After receiving that call, the phone was immediately turned off. From that moment onward, it never connected to the network again. Almost as if its only purpose had been to receive that one call. When police told Daniel about this discovery, his reaction was unusual. He remained silent for a long time. Then he said something simple. "That wasn't me." Investigators asked, "What were you doing at 2:12 a.m.? Daniel answered, "I was in the kitchen." "Why?" He replied, "Because I heard something in the living room." According to Daniel's account, this was what happened. That night, he woke up because of a faint sound. Something like plastic scraping. At first he thought it was the window. Maybe something moving in the wind. So he walked out of the bedroom. The living room was dark. But he remembered one specific detail. The indicator light on the landline phone was on. Like it had just been used. At the time, he didn't think much about it. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water. Then, his mobile phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. The call lasted only 3 seconds. He answered. No one spoke. There was only a very faint sound. Breathing. Then, the call disconnected. Investigators quickly checked his phone records. The call was real. Time: 2:14 a.m. 3 minutes before the emergency call. The number that called him was the same prepaid phone that had received the landline call, which meant the sequence of events might have been 2:12 a.m. Someone inside the apartment used the landline to make the first call. The prepaid phone answered. 11 seconds later, the call ended. 2 minutes later, the prepaid phone called Daniel. The call lasted 3 seconds. Then the phone powered off. 3 minutes after that, Daniel called the police. That was the recorded emergency call. At first, the situation seemed explainable. Maybe someone had entered the apartment, used the landline, then left. But when investigators reconstructed the scene, they encountered a problem that couldn't be explained. The 2:12 a.m. call had been dialed from the living room landline, and the phone contained no fingerprints from anyone else, only one person's, Daniel's. It became even stranger. During technical reconstruction, investigators noticed something about the dialing pattern. The number dialed from the landline matched exactly a number stored in Daniel's phone contacts. The contact name was extremely strange. It was saved as Second Time. Investigators asked him, "Who is this contact?" Daniel frowned. "I've never saved a contact like that." But when technicians opened his phone contacts, the entry was clearly there. The number was the prepaid phone, and the contact label read, Second Time. Just as investigators prepared to continue the inquiry, another discovery surfaced. The emergency call at 2:17 a.m. actually contained a segment of audio that had never been publicly released. At the very beginning of the call, the dispatcher had asked the standard question, 911, what's your emergency? Daniel didn't respond immediately. He paused for about 2 seconds. Then he spoke. But the first thing he said was not, "Someone is in my house." Instead, he said something else. At the time, everyone assumed it was just panic-induced nonsense. But now, listening again, the sentence sounded deeply disturbing. Daniel had said, "I know this is already the second time." When investigators first traced the prepaid phone number, they assumed it was nothing unusual. Disposable phones were common. No registration, no address, just another anonymous number. But when the telecommunications records came back, they revealed something that made the case far more unsettling. Because that phone had not been used recently. In fact, its last recorded activity was 3 years earlier. According to the carrier's database, the SIM card had been activated 3 years ago. It remained active for about 2 months. During that time, it handled a handful of short calls. Then, it suddenly went silent. No calls, no messages, no network connections, nothing. For 3 years, the phone essentially did not exist in the system. Until the night of the incident. At 2:12 a.m., the system suddenly registered an incoming call. Duration: 11 seconds. Then, 2 minutes later, at 2:14 a.m., the phone made an outgoing call. Duration: 3 seconds. After that, the signal disappeared again. The phone never reconnected to the network. It was almost as if the device had briefly woken up, just long enough to receive and make those 2 calls. Even stranger, when police checked the SIM registration records, they found an optional field in the carrier database, an emergency contact number. This field was rarely used, and many customers simply typed random numbers. But this one wasn't random. It was a landline number. Police traced the address. It was located in the same apartment building. 3rd floor. Daniel's apartment was on the 4th. When investigators knocked on the 3rd floor door, they were greeted by a woman in her 50s. Her name was Mary Carter. When they told her the number, she froze for several seconds. Then she quietly said, "That was my son's phone." Investigators asked, "Where is he now?" Mary paused, then answered, "He died 3 years ago." Her son's name was Lucas. 3 years earlier, he had lived in the 4th floor apartment, the same apartment where Daniel now lived. According to Mary, Lucas was a quiet person. He rarely socialized, but he had one strange habit. He often made phone calls in the middle of the night. Sometimes he called friends. Sometimes he called her. And sometimes he simply dialed a number and said nothing at all. She always assumed he suffered from insomnia. But the phone records later showed something very different. Lucas wasn't randomly calling people. He was doing something very specific. Every night at the same time, he called the same number. He did this for nearly 2 months. The prepaid phone was the phone he used for those calls, which meant Lucas had been calling his own second phone every night. Investigators asked Mary, "Did he ever explain why?" She shook her head. "I asked him once. He said the phone wasn't for someone else." She paused, trying to remember the exact words. Then she slowly repeated them. "He said it was for." The next time, police later discovered another strange detail. The night Lucas died also involved a phone call. It happened 3 years earlier, late at night. The exact time was 2:17 a.m. The same time Daniel called the police. That night, neighbors reported hearing voices coming from Lucas's apartment. It sounded like an argument, but according to the original police report, Lucas had been alone in the apartment. When officers arrived, they found him lying on the living room floor, dead. The cause of death was later ruled sudden cardiac arrest. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of intrusion. The case was closed as a natural death. But there had been one strange detail. On the table beside him was a phone. The screen showed a call screen. The number displayed was the prepaid phone. Call duration 0 seconds. As if the call had just been placed, and then something had interrupted it. When investigators reconstructed the timeline, an unsettling pattern began to appear. 3 years ago, 2:17 a.m., Lucas collapsed in the living room. His phone had just dialed the prepaid number. 3 years later, same apartment, 2:12 a.m., someone used the landline to call that same prepaid phone. 2 minutes later, the prepaid phone called Daniel. 3 minutes after that, Daniel called the police. Time, 2:17 a.m. The sequence looked like a strange repetition, almost like the same event was occurring again, on the same schedule. But the most disturbing discovery came from the 3-second call at 2:14 a.m. Daniel had not recorded the call. However, telecom servers sometimes store short fragments of signal buffer data. Technicians managed to recover a tiny portion of audio. The sound quality was terrible, mostly noise. But after heavy amplification and filtering, they managed to isolate a voice. It wasn't Daniel's, and it wasn't the dispatcher. The voice sounded distant, low, almost like it was coming through static. It spoke only 4 words. "Don't answer the second call. When investigators played the audio for Daniel, his face immediately changed. He sat quietly for a long time. Then he said something that shifted the entire case. "I already answered it." One investigator asked, "When?" Daniel looked up slowly, as if he needed to confirm something. Then he said, 3 years ago." When Daniel said that sentence, the interrogation room fell silent. 3 years ago. At first, investigators assumed he had simply misspoken, because according to all official records, Daniel Carter moved into the apartment 2 years ago. The lease, building records, neighbor testimonies, everything matched. Before that, the 4th floor unit belonged to someone else. Lucas, the man who died 3 years earlier. So the investigators immediately replied, "You couldn't have answered that call 3 years ago. You didn't live there yet." But Daniel shook his head. Then he said something even stranger. "I was living there." Police checked every rental record again. 3 years earlier, only one tenant was listed. Lucas. Daniel's name appeared nowhere. At first, investigators assumed he was simply mistaken. But something else soon changed their thinking. They began re-interviewing neighbors from that time. Many residents had moved away. But Mary on the 3rd floor was still there. So was an elderly couple on the 5th. Investigators asked them, 3 years ago, did Lucas live alone? The old couple answered confidently at first, "Yes. Just him." But as they continued thinking, the wife suddenly hesitated. She frowned, as if trying to recall something distant. Then she said, "Sometimes, I think I heard 2 people talking." Her husband quickly dismissed it. That was the television. Lucas watched TV late at night. But the woman shook her head. No. It sounded like real voices. She remembered hearing arguments. Late at night. Around midnight or later. 2 people talking. Though the voices were muffled. She had always assumed it was a TV show. Investigators wrote the statement down. When they left the building, one detective thought of something. If Daniel had truly stayed there 3 years ago, there had to be some trace. So they searched older records, bank logs, phone activity, work history. Soon something appeared. 3 years ago, Daniel did live in the city. His workplace was only 2 streets away from the apartment. A night shift warehouse. More importantly, police discovered an old shipping receipt. Sender address. 4th floor apartment. Sender name. D. Carter. Date. 3 years ago. Things were becoming complicated. If Daniel really stayed there 3 years ago, why were there no official records? The landlord was eventually located. After searching through old paperwork, he remembered something. 3 years earlier, Lucas had asked him a small favor. He said a friend might occasionally stay overnight. The friend worked night shifts and sometimes needed a place to sleep. The landlord hadn't cared much. That kind of thing was common in older buildings, as long as it wasn't permanent. They rarely updated records. The landlord said he once heard the friend's name, but he couldn't remember it, until investigators showed him Daniel's photo. He stared at it for a long time, then slowly nodded. That might be him. The timeline slowly became clearer. 3 years ago, Lucas lived in the apartment. Daniel sometimes stayed overnight, which meant, on the night Lucas died, there might have been 2 people inside the apartment. And the argument neighbors heard may not have been a television. It may have been real. Investigators asked Daniel again, what happened that night? Daniel remained silent for a long time, as if recalling something. He didn't want to remember. Finally he said, "We were making a call." "Calling who?" investigators asked. Daniel answered, "The future." The room suddenly felt colder. Investigators assumed he was joking, but Daniel's expression was completely serious. He explained, "The prepaid phone wasn't random. It was Lucas's idea. Lucas believed that if they called the same number, at the same time every night, eventually, someone would answer." "Why?" investigators asked. "Because," Daniel said, "it was a call to the future." According to Daniel, one night 3 years ago, they heard a voice from the other side of the phone. It lasted only a moment. Just one sentence: "Don't answer the second call." At the time, they thought it was a prank. But Lucas became excited. He believed it proved something. The call had reached the future, because someone in the future was warning them. Daniel thought it was just a strange game, but Lucas insisted they continue calling every night for 2 months, until one night, 2:17 a.m., the phone connected again. This time, the voice on the other end said something that made Lucas suddenly turn pale. Investigators asked Daniel, "What did it say?" Daniel lowered his head. He stayed silent for a long time. Then he slowly answered. "It said, 'You've already died once.'" 3 real events, each happening at a different time, in a different place. In 2016, a security camera recorded a man who vanished in 3 seconds, leaving no trace behind. In 2019, an old photograph revealed a person who did not exist. His position, his smile, as if he had never been recorded at all. In 2017, a late-night emergency call captured a man saying something chilling: "I've already died once." Police investigations, archives, technical analysis, all left complete records. Yet the reason, the truth behind these events, remains unknown. Some things do not disappear with time, nor can they be uncovered by technology. When you look back at these images, when you replay these moments, you realize some events will always stay in the shadows, hidden in a truth you cannot reach. And maybe, one day, you will witness one of those moments that was recorded, but cannot be explained.